Welcome, everyone. Today's story is one of unexpected transformation, where a humble janitor steps into the world of high-stakes business, facing challenges that will test her courage, resilience, and authenticity. It's a journey of overcoming doubt, seizing opportunities, and proving that anyone, regardless of their background, can make a difference. Let's dive in. Jonathan Carter's footsteps echoed in the vast marble lobby of Blake Enterprises as he strode towards the elevator. The tall, glass walls of the building reflected the early morning light. But for Jonathan, the warmth of the sun could never penetrate the cold that seemed to have settled in his heart. The city outside moved at a frantic pace, but Jonathan felt as though he were stuck, caught in a cycle of sleepless nights and ever-growing pressure. The multi-million-dollar deal he was working on was teetering on the edge of collapse, and the foreign investors he had been courting were showing signs of hesitation. He could feel it, the weight of failure pressing down on him. He entered the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. As the doors closed with a soft hum, Jonathan let out an almost imperceptible sigh, trying to shake off the tightness in his chest. The world of business was a brutal one, and in it, he had built an empire. Yet, despite all his wealth and success, he could not escape the emptiness that gnawed at him. The luxurious penthouse he returned to every night, the lavish dinners, the expensive suits, they meant nothing in the face of the growing isolation he felt. He had no real connection to anyone, not even to his employees, most of whom he saw only as instruments to be used for profit. When the elevator reached the top floor, Jonathan stepped out, greeted by his ever-efficient assistant, Sarah. She handed him a black coffee, as she always did, and provided him with the day's agenda. The reports he had requested were waiting on his desk, and the video conference with Tokyo was set for 10 a.m. Jonathan nodded at her words, absorbing the information like he always did. But his mind was elsewhere, caught in the labyrinth of thoughts that circled around the deal that could make or break him. As he walked down the corridor to his office, something unusual caught his eye. A woman, middle-aged, was cleaning the windows along the hallway. It was not the fact that she was there that surprised him. Blake Enterprises had a team of janitors who kept the building spotless. What caught his attention was the way she worked. Her movements were fluid and graceful, a quiet dedication in her every step. Despite the sterile, corporate world around her, she exuded a kind of warmth and authenticity that felt almost out of place. Jonathan stopped, his gaze fixed on her. There was something captivating about the way she carried herself, so simple, yet so honest. Something about her sincerity stirred a long-forgotten feeling inside him, a feeling he had not experienced in years. The world around him, with its polished suits and calculated smiles, suddenly seemed so much emptier in comparison. He called out to Sarah, who was following him a few paces behind. "Who is that woman?" Sarah glanced in the direction Jonathan was looking. "Oh, that's Emily Brooks. She's been with us for about 6 months. One of the most dedicated janitors we've had." Jonathan's interest peaked further. He watched Emily for a few more moments, trying to make sense of the strange pull he felt. She was just a janitor, after all. Yet there was something in her that seemed to shine through the dullness of the office. "I want to meet her," Jonathan said, his voice firm, though there was an uncertainty in his words, as though he were questioning his own decision. "Invite her to my office. I need to talk to her." Sarah turned to him, clearly surprised. "Mr. Carter, are you sure about this? I mean, she's just—" "I know," Jonathan interrupted, his tone cutting short Sarah's hesitation. "Just do it, and make sure she wears something appropriate. This is important." Sarakada Smashnot, still uncertain, but she knew better than to question Jonathan when he made a decision. She turned and walked away, leaving Jonathan to his thoughts. He couldn't explain why he was doing this, why he felt compelled to invite a janitor into his world, a world so far removed from hers. But something about Emily had struck a chord in him, a reminder of what he had lost, a reminder of the authenticity that had long been buried beneath layers of wealth and power. As he entered his office, Jonathan sat at his desk, the papers in front of him blurring into insignificance. His mind kept wandering back to Emily, What was it about her? He had built an empire, but he couldn't deny that there was something far more real in Emily's simple presence than in all the accolades and trophies on his office shelves. When Sarah returned, she handed Jonathan a luxurious package. Her expression mixed with confusion and curiosity. "I've spoken with her, Mr. Carter. She's agreed to come up to your office." "She's a bit surprised." Jonathan nodded. His decision now solidified. It was unusual. It was risky, but it felt right. He looked out the window, his thoughts swirling. Tomorrow would be the day he would face the investors. He needed something extraordinary, something that would break through the tension in the room. Could Emily be that something? The door to his office opened, and in walked Emily. She was nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she carried herself with all the poise she could muster. Despite the stark contrast between her janitor's uniform and the luxurious surroundings, Jonathan stood to greet her, his eyes assessing the transformation. "Mrs. Brooks," Jonathan began, his voice softer than usual. "Thank you for coming." Emily looked around the office, feeling completely out of place. Her simple janitor's uniform had been replaced with an elegant, navy blue dress. For a moment, she didn't even recognize herself. She felt like she was stepping into another world, one that she had never imagined could be a part of her life. I don't understand," Emily stammered, her voice trembling. "Why am I here?" Jonathan studied her for a moment before responding. "I've been watching you, Mrs. Brooks. Your dedication, your authenticity, they're qualities that are rare in this world. And those are exactly the qualities that we need to close a crucial deal tomorrow." Emily blinked, still confused. "But I'm just a janitor," she said, her voice laced with disbelief. "What could I possibly contribute to a business meeting?" Jonathan smiled then, a rare, genuine smile that seemed to warm the room. "Sometimes, Mrs. Brooks, it is precisely what we consider our greatest weakness that can become our greatest strength. Your unique perspective, your honesty, these things could be the differentiator we need." Emily felt a mixture of fear and excitement swelling in her chest. It was an opportunity she never dreamed would come her way, but it was also an immense responsibility. Jonathan believed in her, trusted her, but could she rise to the challenge? I don't know if I can do it," Emily admitted, her voice trembling. Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, his voice low but filled with certainty. "I believe you can. More than that, I believe you should. Sometimes, life presents us with unexpected opportunities. It's up to us to have the courage to seize them." Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words sink into her. She was scared, yes, but she was also excited. For the first time in years, she felt like she had a chance to prove herself, to show the world, and herself, that she was capable of more than what people saw on the surface. "Okay," she said finally, her voice growing stronger. "I accept." Jonathan's smile deepened, and for the first time in a long time, Emily felt like she was standing on the precipice of something extraordinary. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: she would not let this opportunity slip away. As she left Jonathan's office that day, Emily felt like she was floating. The stunning dress, the unexpected invitation, the trust Jonathan had placed in her. Everything felt like a dream, but it was real. And for the first time in her life, Emily knew that her world was about to change forever. This wasn't just a chance to prove herself to Jonathan, to the investors, or to the company. It was a chance to prove to herself that she was more than what she had been, that she could rise above her circumstances and take control of her destiny. Tomorrow would be the day that everything changed, and Emily Brooks was ready. The next morning, Emily woke to the soft light of the rising sun spilling through the modest curtains of her small apartment. She looked at the navy blue dress hanging on the back of her bedroom door, a symbol of the unexpected invitation that had turned her world upside down. The dress was a sharp contrast to her usual attire, the simple janitor's uniform that had defined her for years. Now, she was about to step into a new role, a world she never imagined could be hers. Her heart raced as she stood up, her hands trembling slightly as she went through the motions of preparing her breakfast. Each movement felt deliberate, weighted with the significance of the day ahead. She had always considered herself invisible in the corporate world, just one of many overlooked workers who kept the wheels of the business turning, yet never seen. Now, she was about to attend a meeting that could alter the course of her life. The thought terrified her. She stared at her reflection in the kitchen window, her face a mixture of fear and determination. "You can do this, Emily," she whispered to herself, as though trying to remind the woman staring back at her that she wasn't just a janitor anymore. She was something more. She had to be. At exactly 8 a.m., there was a knock at the door. Emily opened it to find Sarah, Jonathan's assistant, accompanied by a team of stylists and makeup artists. The sight of them sent a wave of shock through Emily. But Sarah's calm, professional smile grounded her. "Good morning, Mrs. Brooks," Sarah said, her voice reassuring. "Mr. Carter wants to make sure you feel comfortable and confident today. Shall we get started?" Emily's mind raced as she stood there, unsure of what to do or say. I wasn't expecting all this," she stammered, glancing at the stylists who had already begun setting up their tools. "It all felt like a dream. Mr. Carter wants to ensure you look and feel your best. We have plenty of time. Don't worry," Sarah said, gently guiding Emily inside. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. The stylists worked meticulously, treating Emily as though she were royalty. Luxurious creams were massaged into her skin. Her hair was washed and styled, and her nails were manicured to perfection. The transformation was nothing short of extraordinary. Emily had never experienced anything like this before. She had never been given so much attention, so much care. At first, she felt out of place, the unfamiliar luxury of it all making her feel like an imposter. But as the minutes passed and she saw herself in the mirror, her self-consciousness began to melt away. The reflection staring back at her was no longer just a tired, worn-out janitor. It was a woman who carried herself with a new grace, a new elegance. For the first time in her life, Emily felt beautiful. The woman she had been hiding deep inside was finally allowed to emerge. Finally, it was time to put on the dress. Sarah helped her slide the fabric over her body, adjusting it carefully. The dress fit perfectly, accentuating curves Emily never knew she had. The navy blue fabric catching the light in a way that made her look radiant. "Perfect," Sarah murmured, stepping back to admire the result. Emily turned to face the full-length mirror, her breath catching in her throat. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, yet not. She barely recognized herself. The transformation was so complete. She wondered if this was a version of herself she had always wanted to be, but never had the courage to embrace. "You're ready," Sarah said, checking her watch. "The car is waiting downstairs." Emily's stomach churned with nerves. The drive to the office felt like a blur. The luxury of the car, the polished windows, the city flashing by, it all seemed like a dream. She couldn't shake the feeling that at any moment, she would wake up, back in her small apartment, back to the life she had known. When they arrived at the Blake Enterprises building, Emily stepped out of the car, feeling all eyes on her. The employees in the lobby stared at her as she walked past, whispers following her every step. She could feel the eyes of the other employees burning into her. Some curious, some skeptic. She was used to being invisible, but now she was suddenly the center of attention. Sarah walked beside her, her presence a steadying force. Yet Emily felt more exposed than ever before. They rode the elevator to the top floor, and when the doors opened, Jonathan was there, waiting for her. He was impeccably dressed in his usual dark gray suit, his posture tall and confident. But there was a softness in his eyes as he took in the sight of her. "Mrs. Brooks," Jonathan said, his voice softer than usual. "You look stunning." Emily flushed, unsure of how to respond. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hardly recognize myself." Jonathan smiled, offering her his arm. "Shall we?" As they walked down the corridor together, Emily couldn't help but notice the shocked looks from the employees in the hallway. Many of them were people who had barely noticed her before. But now, they stared at her with a mixture of surprise and, in some cases, jealousy. She could feel the weight of their gazes as they passed, each step bringing her closer to a world she had never imagined being a part of. When they reached the conference room, Emily's nerves intensified. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she prepared to face the investors. Jonathan led her inside, where the large, mahogany table gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the windows. The investors were already seated, their eyes fixed on her as she entered the room. There was a mixture of curiosity and skepticism in the air, and Emily felt it. She was not supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be a part of this world. Jonathan spoke first, his voice confident. As always, "Gentlemen," he began, "I would like to introduce you to someone who has been instrumental in the changes you've seen in the company. Emily Brooks has a unique perspective on the operations of this business, and I believe her insights will be crucial in our discussion today." Emily's heart skipped a beat as all eyes turned to her. She felt the weight of their gazes, the pressure mounting with every second that ticked by. She had never spoken in front of such an important audience before. She had never been seen like this. But Jonathan's words, his trust in her, gave her the courage to step forward. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her back and began to speak, her voice trembling at first but gradually gaining strength. "I may not have the experience in business that you all have," she began, her voice steadying, "but I do have something that I believe is just as valuable, a perspective from the ground level. The people who work here, the ones who clean the floors, make the coffee, and do the work that keeps this company running, they see things that you don't." As Emily spoke, she saw the investors lean forward. Intrigued, Jonathan, watching her closely, was clearly impressed, though he maintained his usual composed demeanor. But Emily could feel the shift in the room. The investors were no longer just curious. They were listening. They were hearing her, seeing her, for the first time not as a janitor, but as someone with something valuable to contribute. When she finished speaking, the room was silent. And then, slowly, Mr. Tanaka, one of the senior investors, began to clap. His applause was soon joined by the others, and Emily's chest swelled with pride. She had done it. She had spoken her truth, and it had made a difference. Jonathan smiled at her, his eyes filled with admiration. "That," he said, "is exactly the kind of insight we need. Thank you, Emily." For the first time in her life, Emily Carter felt like she had truly made her mark. The days following the investors' meeting were a blur of activity. Emily had proven herself in a way she had never imagined possible. But now, she had to face the consequences of her newfound visibility. The executives who had once ignored her now seemed to be watching her every move. Her status had changed, and with it, the way the company's employees, from top to bottom, regarded her. Some saw her as a rising star, a beacon of possibility in the otherwise cutthroat world of corporate politics. Others, particularly those at the top, including Richard Hawthorne, the CFO, seemed to view her presence as a threat. Emily felt like she was walking a tightrope, balancing precariously between two worlds that were as unfamiliar to her as they were intimidating. At her new desk, which sat on the executive floor, Emily adjusted to her new reality. She had been given an office, modest but elegant, in the corner of the floor. It was a space that reflected her new role, neither the janitor's closet she had once inhabited, nor the sleek, polished spaces of her executive colleagues. It felt like a bridge between the two, a delicate balance between where she had come from and where she was now. The buzz of phones, the ringing of conversations, the clicking of keyboards, all of it seemed amplified in the sterile environment of the executive floor. The chatter filled her ears like a constant reminder of how out of place she felt, though she worked hard to ignore it and settle into her new routine. The spreadsheets, the jargon that danced before her eyes, it was all so overwhelming. She had been thrust into this world of financial projections, quarterly figures, and boardroom decisions, and she was still learning how to navigate it. Jonathan had made her the leader of a new task force to investigate inefficiencies in the company. He had explained to her that they needed her unique perspective, the one she had demonstrated in the meeting, to bring a fresh pair of eyes to the internal operations. The weight of the responsibility was heavy on her shoulders. But she knew she had to rise to the challenge. Every day, she spent hours poring over reports, conducting interviews with employees from all departments, trying to understand the small inefficiencies that, when stacked together, could cost the company more than it realized. She had already seen the potential for change, the small things that no one in upper management would have noticed, the hallway conversations, the way employees interacted, the little frustrations that went unaddressed. They all told a story that no report or financial statement could capture. Emily's heart was in her work, and she was determined to prove that she could help make the company better, not just for the bottom line, but for the people who made the company run. But her new position didn't come without challenges. The executives, particularly Richard, viewed her presence with disdain. He had never seemed to trust her, and his cold, calculating nature was at odds with Emily's down-to-earth approach. Emily had noticed the way he would glance at her during meetings, his eyes filled with skepticism. To him, she was still just a janitor in a dress, playing dress-up in a world she didn't belong in. Despite this, Emily focused on her work, pushing forward with the task force she had been appointed to lead. She spent long hours investigating, digging through company records, and interviewing employees. Her team, although full of skepticism at first, began to warm to her genuine approach. She wasn't trying to prove she knew more than they did. She was simply trying to learn, to understand, and to make things better. It was late one evening when Emily found herself alone in her new office, the only light coming from her desk lamp. The office was quiet. Almost tout quiet. She sat at her desk, poring over a set of financial records, when she overheard voices in the hallway. She immediately recognized the voice of Richard Hawthorne, and it sent a chill down her spine. "You're throwing everything away, Jonathan." Richard's voice was sharp, full of accusation. "First, you bring that janitor to board meetings, and now you let her lead critical projects? You're risking everything." Emily froze in place, her heart pounding in her chest. She had expected some tension, but this felt like an outright attack. Her presence had clearly ruffled feathers, but she hadn't realized how far the resentment extended. Richard's words cut deep. He didn't just see her as a threat, he saw her as a mistake that could ruin everything. Jonathan's voice responded, quieter but no less firm. "Emily brings a perspective we need. You may not like it, Richard, but it's what this company needs right now. You're blind to what she's doing to us." Richard spat. "I warned you about this." Emily quickly ducked her head, trying to make herself as invisible as possible. She didn't want to hear anymore, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. She was trapped, caught between two worlds, the one where she was nothing more than a janitor, and the one where she was a disruptor, an outsider in a world that wasn't ready for her. The next morning, Emily arrived at work early, her mind swirling with the weight of what she had overheard. She could feel the tension in the air, the invisible wall between her and the rest of the employees. No one spoke to her directly, but she could feel their eyes on her. Some of the executives avoided her completely, while others gave her cold, calculated nods as they passed. It was clear she had been labeled as a threat, someone who didn't belong, but she refused to let it stop her. She was here for a reason, and she had no intention of letting anyone, especially Richard, push her out. When Jonathan entered the office, his expression was weary, the exhaustion from the constant strain of running the company visible in the dark circles under his eyes. Yet, when he saw Emily, his face softened. "How are you doing today, Emily?" Jonathan asked, his voice low and gentle. Emily looked up from her desk, surprised by his concern. "I'm hanging in there," she replied, offering a small smile. "But I overheard something last night, something about the tension in the company." Jonathan's expression darkened slightly, but he nodded. "Richard doesn't like the changes, but that's not something we can control. What's important is that we stay the course. You're doing great work, Emily. Don't let anyone take that away from you." Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest at Jonathan's words. He had always believed in her, even when the others didn't. It was that belief that kept her going. As long as Jonathan stood by her, she felt like she could face anything, despite the tension, despite the whispers and the glances. Emily worked harder than ever. She continued to push forward with her task force, her ideas gaining traction among the investors. Slowly, she was making a difference. The company was beginning to see her not just as the janitor who had been plucked from obscurity, but as someone who could bring real, tangible change. But the road ahead was not without its obstacles. Richard's disdain for Emily didn't go unnoticed, and Emily knew he was waiting for her to slip up, to show that she didn't belong. But she refused to let that fear consume her. She had already proven herself once, and she was determined to keep proving herself. One thing was certain: Emily Carter had entered a new world. It was a world that demanded everything from her, a world that wasn't ready for someone like her, but a world she was going to change, one step at a time. The weeks following Emily's leadership in the investors' meeting felt like a whirlwind. She had begun to settle into her new role, but the transition was far from easy. The company had started to change, and with those changes came growing pains. Emily found herself constantly walking the line between two worlds, the one she had once inhabited as a janitor, and the one she now occupied as an executive. Her office was no longer a humble corner on the executive floor, but a space that reflected the new expectations of her. Still, it never felt entirely hers. It was a constant reminder of the awkwardness she felt in this new role. The sophisticated and polished environment of the corporate world was both exhilarating and suffocating. In every meeting, every interaction with the executives, Emily found herself holding her breath, wondering if today would be the day she was exposed as a fraud. Despite the success she had brought with her unique perspective, the whispers among the higher-ups didn't stop. Richard Hawthorne, the CFO, was still visibly resentful of Emily's role, and she couldn't shake the feeling that his cold stares and passive-aggressive remarks were aimed directly at her. He seemed to believe that someone like her, someone without the right background, without the right pedigree, had no place in the inner circle. Every time he spoke, Emily could feel the tension, like he was watching her for any sign of weakness, any slip-up that would justify his skepticism. Emily had made mistakes. Of course, she was still learning the ropes of the corporate world, still trying to figure out the intricacies of the business she was now part of. But for every misstep, there were two more moments where her instincts had proven to be valuable. Employees were beginning to speak to her more openly, and she had gained the respect of many on the shop floor. They saw her not as a symbol of management, but as someone who understood their struggles. She began to develop a rapport with the staff, her ideas helping to improve morale and efficiency. But the higher she climbed, the more she realized that the higher you rise, the more isolating it can become. One afternoon, as Emily sat in her office catching up on a stack of reports, she received an unexpected email from Jonathan. It was brief, but to the point. "We have an urgent meeting this afternoon. I need you there." Emily's heart skipped a beat. Another big meeting, another chance to prove herself, or perhaps another moment where her newfound position would be put to the test. She took a deep breath and smoothed down her blouse, making sure she was presentable. Though she had been an executive for several weeks now, the weight of the title still felt foreign to her. She was still trying to figure out how to balance the demands of the role with the inner part of her that was still the same: humble, hardworking, the janitor who had once swept floors in this very building. When she arrived at the conference room, Jonathan was already there, his usual confident demeanor overshadowed by a subtle tension in his shoulders. Richard, the CFO, was already seated, his cold eyes meeting hers as she entered. There were several other executives in the room, including Sarah, Jonathan's trusted assistant, and a few department heads. All of them turned to look at her when she walked in. The silence that followed was heavy. Jonathan stood up to greet her, his usual warmth replaced with a kind of formality. "Emily, thank you for joining us. We have some urgent matters to discuss." He gestured for her to sit at the table, and as she did, she noticed the discomfort on the faces of the others. They were still not sure what to make of her, and she could feel it. Richard, of course, was the first to speak. His voice was thick with condescension, as though Emily's presence was an inconvenience. "Jonathan, are we really going to let her handle this meeting? Do you really think a janitor? No offense, Miss Carter, has any idea about handling these high-level discussions." His words were sharp, and though he tried to mask it with politeness, the disdain was clear. Emily's hands clenched in her lap, but she refused to let his words shake her. Jonathan, for his part, remained calm. "Richard, I've asked Emily to join us because I believe she has insights that you do not. She's been helping us streamline the company's operations. Her perspective is invaluable." The tension in the room escalated, but Emily held her ground. She wasn't going to be intimidated. Not anymore. As the meeting began, Jonathan outlined the issue: declining profits and internal inefficiencies that needed to be addressed immediately. The investors were concerned, and the pressure was mounting. Richard, as usual, was quick to push for drastic cost-cutting measures. "We need to slash expenses. Jonathan, start with the maintenance and cleaning staff. We can outsource. It'll save us millions." Emily's stomach turned. She had worked alongside those staff members. She had seen the value they brought to the company, even if no one else had noticed. To her, it wasn't just about numbers. It was about the people who made those numbers happen. She opened her mouth before she could stop herself. "With all due respect, Mr. Hawthorne, I believe outsourcing the maintenance staff will do more harm than good. They are the backbone of this company. You can't measure loyalty, commitment, and hard work in spreadsheets." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, some with skepticism, others with a mix of surprise and curiosity. Jonathan gave her a subtle nod, his face giving away nothing. Richard, on the other hand, looked like he was about to explode. "This is absurd," he muttered under his breath. "You're talking about keeping dead weight." Emily ignored him, her eyes meeting Jonathan's. "I believe if we focus on inefficiencies in other areas like the supply chain or redundant processes in HR, we can save money without jeopardizing the people who keep this company running." Jonathan, sensing an opportunity, leaned forward. "She's right," he said firmly. "We've ignored these issues for too long." Emily's right. Cost-cutting can't come at the expense of the heart of our company. We need to think long-term, not just about this quarter's profits. The investors exchanged glances, and Emily could see a shift in their demeanor. Some seemed intrigued, while others were still uncertain. Jonathan continued, "Emily's insights go beyond what we can measure in numbers. She's been listening to the employees, talking to them, understanding their needs. This is the kind of perspective that can truly change things." The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. Emily did her best to stay engaged, but the weight of the conversation was exhausting. As the room cleared out, Jonathan stood and turned to her, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. "You did well, Emily. Very well." Her heart raced in her chest, and she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. She had done it. She had stood up to Richard, made a difference, and earned the respect of people who had doubted her. But as she left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that things had just become a lot more complicated. Richard's disdain for her was obvious, and she knew that this would not be the last time she had to defend herself in that room. The stakes were higher now, and the price of failure seemed steeper. But Emily wasn't going to back down. She had made it this far, and now she was ready for whatever came next. The test had only just begun. The days that followed the tense meeting felt like walking on a tightrope for Emily. She had proven herself in front of Jonathan, the investors, and even some of the senior executives. But the road ahead was far from smooth. Richard Hawthorne, the company's CFO, had made it clear that he did not approve of her new position. His disapproving glares followed her wherever she went, and the whispers of discontent from some of the other senior staff grew louder by the day. Despite the challenges, Emily found herself more determined than ever to rise above the doubts. She had been granted a seat at the table, not just by Jonathan, but by her own hard work and insight. She knew it wasn't going to be easy, but she was no longer afraid of the voices that doubted her. She had earned this place. Jonathan, for his part, continued to be her biggest supporter. Over the weeks, their working relationship had become more solid. He saw something in her that no one else had, something that, until now, she hadn't even fully seen in herself. He often pulled her aside to praise her efforts, and his confidence in her began to foster a sense of belonging that she had never thought possible in such a high-stakes environment. Still, Emily couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in the company's atmosphere. Richard was growing bolder in his efforts to undermine her. His remarks were more pointed, and his attempts to discredit her in front of the board were becoming more frequent. One afternoon, as Emily was walking back from a meeting, she overheard a conversation that made her stop in her tracks. That janitor should never have been allowed in that meeting. Richard's voice cut through the hallway, dripping with venom. She's nothing but a distraction. Blake is risking everything on someone who doesn't even know the first thing about running a business. Emily's heart sank. She hadn't been surprised by his disdain, but hearing it so openly hurt. She had expected it. Yes, but it still stung. She paused for a moment, wondering if she should confront him, but quickly dismissed the idea. She couldn't afford to let him see her rattle. She had bigger things to focus on. As she walked back to her office, Jonathan appeared from around the corner. His expression was serious, and she could tell he had overheard Richard's words too. He didn't speak immediately, but motioned for her to follow him. He led her to the quiet, private office at the back of the floor. "Emily," Jonathan said, his tone softer than usual. "I want you to know something." She looked up at him, confusion evident on her face. "I'm aware of Richard's comments," he continued, "and I won't allow him to diminish what you've accomplished here. You've proven your worth. No one can take that away from you." The words were comforting, but they didn't remove the sting of the previous conversation. "I just don't know if I belong here sometimes," Emily admitted, her voice quiet. "I feel like I'm constantly one mistake away from being exposed for what I am, a janitor pretending to be an executive." Jonathan sighed, walking over to the window that looked out over the city. "Emily, you were never just a janitor. You were always more than that. It's easy for people to dismiss you when they don't understand the value of what you bring to the table. But I see you, and more importantly, I believe in you." For the first time, Emily felt the weight of the situation begin to lift. She had doubted herself for so long, wondering if she was ever truly capable of this life. But hearing Jonathan's words, seeing his unwavering confidence in her, something shifted deep inside her. She wasn't just a janitor anymore. She was Emily Carter, a woman who had earned the right to be where she was. The following week, Emily faced another test. It was the company's quarterly review meeting, and this time, she would be presenting her ideas to the board of directors. Jonathan had given her the responsibility of presenting the company's new operational improvements and how they had begun to increase efficiency. But this time, there were no more safety nets. She would be doing this entirely on her own. The night before the presentation, Emily stayed late in the office, poring over the reports, refining her speech. As the hours passed, the office grew quieter, the hum of phones and emails fading into silence. She was exhausted, but the fear of failure kept her glued to her desk. She knew that this meeting would be the moment that determined whether she could truly belong in the corporate world. The stakes had never been higher. At 5 a.m., Jonathan walked in, his tired eyes betraying the pressure he had been under. He had become a mentor of sorts to Emily, always offering advice and encouragement. "Emily, I just wanted to check in," he said softly. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" She smiled wearily. "Nervous, but I think I can do this." Jonathan nodded, walking closer to her desk. "I have no doubt you will. Just remember, you've already earned your place here. Tomorrow is just another step in the journey you're already on." His words were like a balm to her frayed nerves. She wasn't alone in this. Jonathan was right beside her, not just as a boss, but as a supporter. The next morning, as Emily entered the conference room, she could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her. The board members were already seated, their faces a mixture of expectation and skepticism. Richard Hawthorne was there too, his eyes narrow with disdain, waiting for her to falter. Jonathan stood by her side, his presence steadying her. "Go ahead, Emily. You've got this," he said, just loud enough for her to hear. With a deep breath, Emily began her presentation. Her voice was shaky at first, but as she spoke, she grew more confident. She talked about the operational changes, the improved employee satisfaction, and the ways in which the company was evolving from the inside out. She didn't focus on numbers or projections. She told the human story of the company. She spoke about the people who made the business run, their dedication, their insights, their contributions. As she spoke, she could see some of the board members begin to lean forward, their expressions softening. Even Richard's scowl wavered for a brief moment. The room, which had felt like an intimidating sea of judgment only moments before, now felt like a place where her voice mattered. She wasn't just an outsider anymore. She was part of this company, part of its future. By the time Emily finished, the room was silent. The tension had broken. Jonathan stood up, his eyes gleaming with pride. "What Emily has just presented to you is the true heart of this company," he said. "Her perspective is what will move us forward, and her courage has already begun to change the direction we're headed." Emily felt the weight of the moment sink in. She had done it, not just for herself, but for all the people who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated. For the janitors, the workers, the ones who did the hard work but never got the credit. As the meeting concluded, Jonathan gave her a look of approval. And this time, Richard's glare was replaced with reluctant acknowledgement. He didn't like it, but he couldn't deny her contribution. When Emily walked back to her office, she felt a surge of pride that she had never known before. She had passed the test, and she had proven to herself, and to everyone, that she was more than just a janitor. She was a force to be reckoned with. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about finding her place in a world that had once seemed impossible to enter. And she had done it. Emily had become more than a symbol. She had become a leader in her own right. Thank you all for watching today's story. Emily's journey from janitor to corporate leader shows us that with determination, courage, and the right opportunities, we can transform our lives in ways we never imagined. I hope this story inspired you to believe in your own potential. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means the world. See you in the next video with more powerful stories.